Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Ayomide here. Just in case you're new here, on this channel you're going to find DIY sewing tutorials and pattern drafting tutorials. This tutorial shall be on how I made this gathered dress with ruffled sleeve. Okay, and please guys, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, kindly click on the subscribe button below, and without talking too much, let us get started. So guys, to get started, I have my basic bodice block for both the front and the back. So I have my front and I equally have the back, and I drafted this pattern on fold. This is because I'm going to be having an asymmetrical neckline. So drafting both the front and the back on fold would allow me successfully plan my neckline in such a way that it makes it easier for me to cut. Okay, so now this is my front pattern, and my neck width, I made use of 3 inches neck width and 3 inches neck depth, and I've added all the necessary seam allowances to this pattern. I'm also making use of the bust dart and the waist dart technique. If you do not know how to draft a basic bodice pattern, then you should watch my tutorial on that. So the next thing I'll do is to split my back pattern into two. So I'm going to be splitting it along the center back. I also included my zipper allowance to this pattern that I'm working with too. So I'm done splitting my back pattern, then I'll go ahead and pin it down along my zipper allowance. So you need to pin this down in order to be able to draft your asymmetrical neckline. So I'm just going over to use my office pin to secure the zipper allowance down. So once I'm through, this is going to be the outcome of what I have. My back pattern is going to look something like this. So what I'll do next is that I'm going to be grabbing my front pattern, then I'm going to be securing both the front and the back pattern along the shoulder line. So I'm also going over to secure this down along the shoulder line using my office pin. So guys, I'm done. Now let us move over to the neckline proper. Remember I said my neck depth is 3 inches. Okay, now but for the asymmetrical neckline, I want a neck depth of about 5 inches. So I'll just go over and mark 5 inches right there. And from this part of my shoulder, you can choose any part, but I just want to work with this part. On this part, I would go for a shoulder width of 3 inches. Then I'm going to be going over to use my pattern master to create a curve this way. On this part of my pattern, I want to have a bit of armhole because I'm also going to be fixing a sleeve. So from my chest line, I'm going to be coming up by about 3 inches. Then I'm going to be connecting right from my center front up until that point that I marked. Now at this point, you can choose to modify your curve, and that is what I'm doing. I don't want any sharp points along my neckline, so I'm just going over to remodify the shape of my neckline to suit what I want. So the new one is what I'm going to be going for, and I'm going to be disregarding the initial neckline that I drew, and I think this actually looks better than the first one that I drew. Before cutting out, I'm going to be adding half an inch seam allowance along the new neckline. So this would enable me fix my facing because I'm going to be using a facing for this neckline. So I'm just going over to add half an inch seam allowance. Afterwards, I'll go ahead and trim off the neckline. Notice that I'm also trimming along with my back pattern attached. So that is why you have to draft your pattern on fold so that you can get the right neckline for both the front and the back. So I have my front pattern and I also have my back pattern too. So my back pattern is going to be 2 pieces. I'm just going over to indicate back pattern 1 and back pattern 2. Then the next thing I will do is to remove the pins, okay, because I cannot cut my fabric this way. So I'll just remove the pins, and this is what I have for my back pattern, and I also have my front pattern. So my pattern set is ready and it's going to look something like this when we are done. The next thing I'll do is that I'm going to be closing my bust dart. I will transfer my bust dart to the waist. And to do that, I would first of all get rid of the waist dart. that I have on both sides of my pattern. Afterwards, I would grab one end of the dart, one leg of the dart, and then match it up to my bust line, since that is where my dart is starting from, and secure it with a tape. I would repeat the same process for this other side of my pattern too. And once I'm done, I'm going to be trimming off the sides, okay? But sometimes when you close your dart, you might notice that your lines may not match up. So that is why I'm going over to just smoothen the sides before using my scissors to properly trim out my pattern. So my pattern is ready, my front pattern is ready, and my back pattern is equally ready. Now let us move over to the down part. So guys, for the down part, it's going to be a flare, but I would also gather it. So that means I'm going to be adding an extra allowance to it. My actual waist measurement is 25, and I want to add 30 inches extra to it. That would give it 65, or rather I'm adding 35 inches extra to it. 35 inches extra, that will make it 60 inches. So the waist measurement is 60, then the length is going to be 24 inches. Now, since this is a circle, I'm going to be dividing this by 3.14. 60 divided by 3.14 is 19.1. So my radius is going to be 19.1 and the length is going to be 24 inches. Now, if you don't want to gather it, that means you would be dividing your actual waist measurement by 3.14. If you want a fuller circle, you could divide your waist by 6.28. I think one of these days I'm going to do a series on how to cut and sew a half circle. If you are dividing by 3.14, it is a half circle, and also how to cut and sew a full circle and a 720-degree circle. But for now, let us just make do with this. So to my actual waist measurement, I added an extra 35 inches and I divided by 3.14, which is 19.1, and the length is going to be 24. So by the time I cut this out, I'll gather it back to my waist measurement of 25 inches. So because I'm working with large numbers, my table cannot accommodate it. Also, I don't think my camera will be able to fully accommodate it. I'll just illustrate it using this paper. So when you want to cut a half circle, that is when you divide your waist by 3.14, you will need to fold your fabric into two. So let us assume this is our fabric. You fold it into two. From this corner, you're going to be marking your radius. So I'm going to be using a smaller radius for just illustration purposes. So from here, I'll just mark 2 inches. So that means if I'm doing this on my fabric, I will be marking 19.1 inch, since that is my actual radius. But because this is just for illustration purposes, I'm going to be marking 2 inches all around, and then you would connect it. And if you take note, while I was marking, I marked from this region. I marked 2 inches all around from this region without moving my tape away from here. So from here also, I will now mark my length. So if I'm working on my fabric from here, I will be marking 24 inches. So that means from here, I would mark 19, and from here, I would mark 24. Okay, but for this, I'll just go for 4 inches. So from here, I marked 4 inches. When you're marking it, feel free to move around your radius. Then you're going to be connecting it. So use your curve ruler to connect this together. Before cutting out, make sure you add your half-inch seam allowance. Add your half-inch seam allowance before cutting out. So this is what you're going to be cutting out. You cut this out. So when you cut it out, you're going to be having something like this, a half circle. So that is how I'm going to be cutting out my fabric. So guys, I've pinned my pattern, and then I'll just go ahead and start cutting. Okay guys, when you look at this, you will see that there's a dart here. We transferred our bust dart here. Now you can decide to sew it in, but I feel sewing in this amount of dart is quite ridiculous. So you can decide to pleat it on the outside or create gathers, but I don't want any of that. Okay, so I'm going to be doing what is called a dart throwing. So this is just a shortcut anyway. I'll just fold over my fabric like this, as if I'm closing the dart. Then I'm going to be grabbing my scissors and I'll cut along this region. So I'll just come over and then cut. This is because if you cut it straight, you might end up not cutting it really well. So I'll just cut it over. When I open it up, I'll have something like this, okay? Then I'm going to be repeating the same thing for this other side too. Okay guys, so I'm done cutting. Remember I said you can either create gathers or create pleats or sew it in. I want to sew mine in, but I don't want to sew this amount of that in. So what would I do? From here I would come down by 1.5 inch. I'm marking 1.5 inch because your dart is supposed to end 1 inch before your bust, and then the half inch would be for the joining. And from this dart leg I would mark half an inch that I will use to join the darts together, and also half an inch that I will use to sew in the darts together. So I'm going to be connecting all of the points together. Then I'll go ahead and cut it out. When I want to sew, I'm going to be sewing by half inch and by half inch. I'll repeat the same thing for this side too. Okay guys, so I'm done. What I'll do next is to cut out my back pattern. So guys, I'm done cutting out. This is my front pattern. Okay, this is the front. This is one part of the back, the part that comes this way. So when you're cutting your back, please be careful and make sure you cut in such a way that your back pattern would align properly. You don't cut so that you'll not be having two wrong sides. So this part would come here and this other part would come to this side here. So you can see that my side seams are matching up and the wrong side is facing the wrong side. Okay, so be careful when you're cutting your back pattern. That is why it's very good and very important to work with patterns. I have also gone ahead to cut out my flare. This is it on fold. You can see that it is really wide, and this is my wedges. So I'm going to be using my needle and thread to gather this back. You can also use your machine to gather. You can use a gathering foot to also gather. It depends on what you want. Okay, so you can see why I illustrated the flare with a paper, because this is truly wide. Guys, the next thing I will do is to cut out a facing. This is because I want to have a finished look. I want to finish the raw edges of this fabric neatly. You can use a bias, but I prefer to work with facings. And I'm going to be using this pattern. This is one part of my back pattern to illustrate. I would also cut out the other facing for the other pieces this way. So I place my back pattern on my fabric as if I want to cut out the back pattern, and then I'm going to be tracing it along the neckline. Then I'll measure the length of the shoulder slope I want. So my actual shoulder slope is 3.5, but I want my facing to be 2.5 inches. So I'll mark 2.5 inches. Then along the zipper allowance region, I can go for 3 inches. I'll mark 3 inches and then trace it. So I'm going to be removing this. I can still see my markings. I really hope you can see it. And I'll use my pattern master to create a curve. So guys, I'm done cutting the facing out. Okay, so I'm going to be repeating the same thing for this part of my back pattern and also for my front pattern too. So guys, for the sleeve, I've gone ahead to place my fabric on the bias. This is because I want a really full sleeve, and I have my basic sleeve block here. If you do not know how to draft a basic sleeve pattern, I'm going to be putting the link in the description box. So what I will do first is to just pin my basic sleeve on this fabric, and then I'm going to be doing a little bit of modification. I will just go over and then raise up my armhole region of the sleeve. This is to give room for more fullness. Okay, you can decide to trace along your armhole region, but I believe doing this way would give you more fabric, and then you can be able to pleat it in. So I'm just going over to do that. Afterwards, I'm going over to mark the length. This length is 22 inches, but you're going to find out that after we are done with it, it's going to become quite shorter than 22 inches. This is just one of the effects of doing a really booger sleeve. So if you want your sleeve to be long and you want to pleat it or fold it in, I would advise you make the length really long, because by the time you're done creating the whole ruche is going to become short. So I'm just going over to cut out my sleeve, and this is my sleeve. You can see how wide it is. So this is the sleeve for one part, and moving over to the other hand, you know, the other hand is going to look like an off shoulder sleeve, and I have my off shoulder pattern here. So if you do not know how to draft an off shoulder pattern, I have a video on that. You can check it up in my video catalog. For this other sleeve, I want it to have a band height of about 1.5 inch. So I'm just going over to mark 1.5 inch away from my off shoulder sleeve, and I'm going to be cutting this out. I would reattach it back as a band. So I'll just go over and indicate that this is my sleeve band, and I'm supposed to cut 2 pieces of this. The next thing I'll do is to also place my fabric on the bias like I did for the initial sleeve. I will then place my off shoulder sleeve pattern on it. I've gone ahead to also alter the length just like I did for the previous sleeve, and I also added extra fabric along the top part of the sleeve so that I can be able to pleat it in. I'm also going over to notch the midpoint because this is very important and it would guide me when I'm sewing the sleeve in. I'm also going over to cut out my sleeve band. I added the necessary seam allowances and I placed that same fabric onto another fabric on fold, and I'm going over to trim it over. My sleeve is going to have a lining, so I've placed my basic sleeve pattern on my lining, and the length is going to be 16 inches. It's going to be about 4 inches shorter than the main fabric. Please disregard the initial line. So on that line, I'm going to be marking half of my round sleeve plus 1 inch seam allowance, and I think that was about 5.5 inch. Then I would reconnect it back to my cap height measurement. So I'm going to be cutting this out, and then we're also going to be repeating the same thing for the off shoulder sleeve too. So for the off shoulder sleeve, I'm also marking the length of 16 inches. Remember, we took out 1.5 inch from the topmost part of the sleeve, and I'm also marking my round armhole, rather my round sleeve circumference, and I'm also going to be connecting it to my cap height. Once I'm through with this, I would add half an inch to the topmost part of the sleeve and equally cut it out. Alright guys, so it is time for us to sew. This is my front pattern. So what I'll do is that in order to close this dart, I'll fold it over this way, and then I would secure this with a pin, and I'm going to be sewing it by the half an inch allowance that we marked out from the dart. Okay, so if I flip it over, it's going to look close like this. So this is how I'm going to be closing my dart for this side. And once I'm done closing the dart, I would then go over and sew my facing. So to sew in your facing, I use interfacing on the facing to give it more structure. I'll just place right sides against each other, and then I'm going to be sewing it by the half an inch seam allowance that we added. For the back also, I would mark out my darts and sew in my darts, and then place my facing right sides against each other and sew only along the neckline for now. I will also leave my 1 inch zipper allowance here. That means I'll be starting after 1 inch, and then I'm going to be sewing it, and I'll leave half an inch here so that I can be able to fix my zip. And I would also do likewise for here, leave 1 inch zipper allowance and sew it up onto the shoulder points here. So guys, I'm done sewing in my facing on each of my panel pieces. Okay, now the next thing I'll do is to now sew right sides against each other. So I'm going to be picking right sides against each other, and then I'm going to be sewing the sides by my 1 inch seam allowance along the side. And if you want to sew it along the shoulder, just open it up a little bit. I use the hemming tape, so that's why the facing is staying put. Match up your shoulder seam, sew facing to facing and fabric to fabric. Okay, and I will do likewise for this side also. So I'll just put this aside, and then we'll go to the down part. So guys, this is the down part. It is quite wide, but I'll just use this section to illustrate. The first thing I'll do is to turn the hem. with a commercially produced bias. You can use fabric bias if you want. I use between the two, but because this is quite long, I don't want to go through the process of making my own bias tape myself. So I'm going to be using this commercially produced bias. The first thing I'll do is to place it on the right side. I'll sew it all the way down. When I'm done, I will then turn it over so I can stitch this bias on the wrong side. So that is how to sew with a bias. Now, remember we added an extra of about 35 inches to the waist. So what I'll do is I'm going to be gathering it, and this is my waistline, and to gather I'm going to be using a needle and thread. So I'll just pass it through. I'll leave 1 inch for my zipper allowance and then take it this way. So this is how I'm going to be creating gathers along the waistline. Okay, so I'll just stop here because I'm supposed to hem first before creating my gathers. So I'll stop my gathers here. I'll go ahead and hem and then use my hand to create gathers. You can also use a gathering foot. You can use your sewing machine to sew a basting stitch and then pull the thread to form gathers. For the sleeve, you know, one part is going to be like an off-shoulder sleeve, and we cut out a band. So I cut out 2 pieces. I'm going to be joining it together only along the top part. This is the top part that would sit along the shoulder. This is the part that will go to the remaining part of the sleeve, and this here would go into the armhole. So I'm going to be securing them together by 1/2 inch seam allowance just along the top, and then I'm going to be turning it over and giving it a good press. Now let us move over to the sleeve proper. So guys, for the sleeve, this is what I cut out for the off shoulder. And remember, we cut out a lining that is our exact sleeve measurement. We did not add any extra allowance for it. Now I'm going to show us how to go around it. Placing my lining on the right side, I will match the midpoint because I notched the midpoint. I'll match the midpoint of the lining to the midpoint of the fabric. I'll also match this side to this side and equally match this side to this side. What I'll do next is to now use my hand to create pleats in such a way that the whole of this fabric would accommodate this part and the whole of this fabric would fit into this part. So let me just do like an illustration. I'm done creating the pleats on this side. If I flip it over, can you see what is being formed? I would also go over and then use my hand to create the pleat also on this side. If you're working on this particular style and you don't want your pleat to be this large, that means you won't cut your sleeve as full as I did mine. So it's entirely optional. Feel free to be creative and do what suits your taste. Alright guys, I'm done pleating it in, and when I flip it open, this is what I have. You can see how full it is. Now, also at this point, I'm supposed to go and sew this down to secure the pleats down. But let me show you the next step. Once you are done securing this down, flip your lining like this. Remember, this is for the off shoulder sleeve. Flip it like this, then match up this notch also. Match it up. This is the midpoint of the sleeve. Match it up. Match up this part also. So what I will do is I'm also going to be pleating this entire fabric here. I'll pleat it in. I know some people might be wondering, why am I pleating it on the right side? This is because we have a band, and this rough edges would be sitting into the band. It will be sitting into the band, so you would understand it when I'm done. So guys, I just thought to show us the outcome of the sleeve with just pins. Can you see how full it is? So now I'll go over to my sewing machine and then tack this down by 1/4 inch. Once I'm done, I'll turn it inside and also tack this down properly. So this method, I would also use it for my other sleeve too. It is purely the same thing. Place your lining on the right side of your fabric, form your pleats and then tack.
So guys, I've gone ahead to join my bodies together by the sides, and I've also fixed the sleeve to just one part, okay? Don't worry, I'm going to be illustrating it. Now, turning the sleeve inside out, you can see that the lining gave it a finished look. This is how it looks like. So I will just turn it out again for us to see. Now, grabbing my off-shoulder sleeve, I gonna ahead to pleat it along the top and equally also along the bottom. To finish off the sleeve nicely, you're going to be folding over your sleeve in such a way that your lining matches your lining and your fabric matches fabric. So I'm going over to pin fabric to fabric, and I would also pin lining to lining. So I'm going to be sewing it straight down. This would ensure all of your seam lines are properly concealed. So once I'm done sewing, I will turn it inside out. Then I'm going to be grabbing my sleeve band. Remember the band we cut out, and I'm going to be sewing it in such a way that the rough edge at the topmost part is properly concealed inside the band. For the flare part, I have gone ahead to create gathers, and I'm going to be fixing it to the waistline of my bodice. Once I'm done with that, I would equally fix my sleeve, fix my zipper, and then I would be glad to show us the outcome of this dress.
So guys, this is the final outcome of the dress and I love the outcome. You can see the sleeve and the way the gathered waistline came out properly. So this is the sleeve. It is properly and neatly finished. If you enjoyed this video, kindly give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe, and until my next video guys, have a wonderful day.